My Goldanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about a scene from the book that did not make it into the movie, but which adds some really interesting factors to the story as a whole and makes us think rather differently about Tolkien's world in a few different ways. And that is the episode where the Rohirrim speak to the Wildmen, or the Druidine of the forest that lies in between Edoras and Minas Tirith on their ride to Gondor. So let's go ahead and talk about what happens. So as a way of setting this up, we have to remember first of all that in the book, Éowyn does not reveal who she is to Merry whenever she, takes him along with her. Her incognito persona is Dernhelm, and that's all Merry knows. And it even tells us in the book that she basically talks to nobody, and so there's not even enough of conversation going on for Merry to pick up on who she is. She is in the group of the company that is led by another rider named Elfhelm, and he has some role to play in this. But anyway, as they ride towards Gondor, of course, the darkness that comes out of Mordor clouds over everything, and it gets really dark, and they go into this forest that is on the road, and they've been halted for a while, and Merry's kind of wondering what's happening. And then in these woods with the clouds overhead, it's so dark that he can't even hardly see anything that's going on. And as he's lying there just kind of thinking about, what's going on here, why are we doing stuff, he starts hearing drums, and he starts to worry that they're the drums of the orcs and the Easterlings and whatnot that have attacked Gondor, because they're getting kind of close. And as he's laying there, he ends up getting tripped over by Elfhelm, who takes him for a tree root at first. And it also mentions that Elfhelm and Dernhelm, i.e. Éowyn, have kind of an understanding such that all of Elfhelm's men just kind of pretend that Merry don't exist. And so he kind of gets away with being there despite the king having ordered him not to come. But anyway, Merry says, "I'm not a tree root, I'm a bruised hobbit, and the least you could do to make amends for what you just did is tell me what's going on. Are those the drums of the enemy, or what's going on here?" So Elfhelm tells him no, they're actually the drums of the Woses, or the wild men who live in these woods. But he kind of goes into a little bit of history and says they're like a relic of days gone by, and we don't usually have any kind of dealings with them or anything, but they've offered their services to Theoden, and it's a good thing they're not hunting us, because apparently they're like super good in the woods and use poison arrows and darts and things like that. So that's kind of all Elfhelm tells him, except for the fact that there's some hint that we may be moving out soon, so you might want to pack yourself up, Master Bag, referring to the fact that Merry's not really supposed to exist. At least he's not supposed to be there. So Merry, hearing this, decides, well, I'm going to go see what's going on, because Elfhelm also mentioned one of the headmen of the Woses is meeting with Theoden right now. So he creeps closer to the main camp where Theoden and Éomer are, so he can listen in. Once Merry gets there, he sees that there's this kind of short, broad, strange-looking man there who's got like a thin, wispy beard. His arms seem really long, and he's also, the way he's talking is very throaty, and like he understands the common speech, but every now and then he throws in words from a different language. And the description of him is not exactly, not what you would necessarily call attractive, but it does mention also that when he laughs, it's actually a really infectious laugh. Like, it makes you really want to laugh along with him, even though it's kind of strange sounding. And he's talking to Theoden and Éomer and the other captains. And the conversation they're having is, it comes in at the middle, obviously, but when we first come in, the head woodman is, or the Woes or Druidon, whatever you want to call them, is basically saying, no, we're not going to fight for you. We don't fight. That's not what we do. And so Éomer says, but what we need is aid in battle. What can you do for us? And he basically ends up explaining, well, there's this road that goes through the forest that everybody has forgotten about, but we still know about, and we can take you along this path and get you around this huge force of orcs that's, camped out on the main road. And he says that group of orcs, and by the way, whenever he refers to orcs, he calls them Gorgun, which apparently is their own native word for them. And he basically says this host that's camped on the road is greater than the host of the Rohirrim. And Eomer says, how do you know that? And it says the guy's eyes don't really change, but his voice kind of tells that he's not really happy about the fact that Eomer is doubting him. And he says, wild men are free, but we're not children. And I am Ghan-buri-Ghan, and I am a great headman, and I have counted many things in my life, stars and other things. And then he accurately gives a number of the Rohirrim, and he puts it in a score of scores counted 10 times in 5, which ends up coming to 6,000, which is pretty much the number of the Rohirrim. And then he says, the Gorgun have more. So this guy is definitely savvy in his own ways. But anyway, he continues and says, these guys on the road, we can get you around them with this path. And then they end up kind of going into a bit of a debate as to, how long is this going to take and all this kind of stuff, because we have need of haste. And while he basically said, he basically says, we can take you along this path and it won't take all that long. And Eomer's like, well, we're going to have to go at like a foot pace because you're walking. And he says, well, the wild men go quick on their feet, so don't worry about that. And he also says, we'll send scouts out to make sure that nobody is, ahead of us or anything like that. And I myself will go with the king, and if I lead you wrong, you can kill me. And so Theoden basically says, so be it. At the end of the conversation, he also, Theoden that is, mentions, if you do successfully bring us through this and do what you're saying you're going to do, then we will give you rich reward. And Ghan-buri-Ghan says, dead men are not friends and they don't give rewards. All we want you to do is go and kill the Gorgun and drive away the darkness with your iron. And he also says, but if you do live through the darkness, then don't hunt wild men like beasts anymore. And Theoden, basically agrees to that. And it's interesting too, because that remark reveals something about the relationship between the wild men and either the Rohirrim or the people in Gondor or somebody, that apparently they've been hunted, like non-humans before, or, maybe even, contemporary with the events that are going on. It's not really clear how recent any of that's been happening, but it's an interesting remark because it definitely implies that either the people of Gondor or the people of Rohan aren't exactly like pure as the driven snow, let's say. And anyway, it's an interesting remark that you don't get any explanation for, but it tells a lot in just that one little bit. Anyway, the king is led directly by Ghan-buri-Ghan, and there's other wild men leading other companies of the Rohirrim, and it takes them a while to get where they're going because they have to go through like a patchy area that doesn't have a road to get to the road that he was telling them about. They finally make it there and they start making a little more progress. And as they get closer, they have scouts that come back and kind of report what's going on. And one of them, the wild men, comes back and basically says, that there's the group that was on the road is still there, but we're past that, and between them and the wall, there's nothing. And he also says that the wall itself is being destroyed by, some of Sauron's forces that already came there. And of course, the wall, this isn't in the movie, so if you're not familiar with the book, you may not realize, but the Pelennor Field is surrounded by a huge outwall that circles the entire area around Minas Tirith, and that was part of the defense at Osgiliath as well as just everywhere else. By this point, of course, the armies of Sauron have already laid siege to Minas Tirith, broken through the outwall at Osgiliath, and they've also taken the outwall at Pelennor Fields and at the north end, and that's how this other orc army got to the north part on the road. But the wall, they've been like breaking apart and whatever. And Eomer says, well, that's great. Now that Sauron is taking the wall out of our way, we can just kind of sweep in. That's kind of nice. And then Ghan-buri-Ghan ends up telling them, okay, well, we've done our part and we're going to get out of here. But he also mentions as he's about to leave, he kind of stops and he's sensing something, and he says, wind is changing. And then he and the wild men just kind of disappear into the woods, and their drums that had been kind of playing just kind of die down, and they all just kind of vanish. You know, again, going back to that idea that Elfhelm mentioned, that they're really, really good in the woods. So, oh, and I forgot to mention too, not only that, but earlier on in the conversation, he had also mentioned, you know, it may be dark, but the sun is up. We can feel her here, you know, and he's like thumping his heart. And so he kind of knows what time it is, even though it's too dark for any of the Rohirrim to tell what's going on. So the wild men are definitely in tune with a lot of things that, you know, more civilized people aren't. So really interesting there. But anyway, they all disappear, and then the Rohirrim complete their ride to Gondor. Of course, after that, they do end up having to have like a small skirmish at the outwall of the Pelennor fields, and that's, you know, a minor thing. It doesn't take much because Sauron didn't have a whole force there. He was expecting to catch them on the main road, and that force is behind them at this point, which they had already discussed and basically said it's not going to matter if they're behind us, because if we don't survive the attack on, you know, the forces besieging Minas Tirith, then it doesn't matter if they're behind us. We're all dead anyway. And if they are behind us, then if we do win, they're cut off, and that's great. So they'd already reckoned on all that. But anyway, they get through the wall, and then of course they have the charge. So that's pretty much all of the additional stuff in the scene. But it's a really interesting scene because it shows us that not all of the men who are living in the western parts of Middle-earth are Númenorian or like near cousins of Númenorian descent, like the Rohirrim are, or the men of Dale. You know, there's men there that are still like a bygone relic of other, you know, peoples that lived there long, long ago. And one of the other interesting things about that too is when Merry first sees some of these, he notices that they look familiar for some reason. Then he recognizes when they're at Dunharrow, there's the path that goes up to the really high place where Aragorn ends up going into the mountain and the Paths of the Dead. And on that winding path, there are a bunch of stone figures of men, and he recognizes that the wild men look exactly like them, but, you know, like living, of course. And for whatever reason, the statues were called Pukul men. That kind of gets talked about earlier on in the story, so, you know, there's a little bit of background there. But again, it's these men just kind of hanging out in these woods, and we don't really have any notion where they come from, what happened to them ultimately, or anything like that. There is some stuff about them in the Unfinished Tales that I'll eventually get into, but that's for a separate video. But the other interesting thing, of course, like I noted, is that reference to the idea of them being hunted. You know, the Ghan-buri-Ghan is, you know, kind of implicitly complaining like, y'all treat us like animals, this is not cool, stop doing that. And Theoden just kind of takes it in stride and doesn't really argue the point. So it's, you know, does Theoden know that this had been going on? Is Theoden aware of it? Is Theoden thinking, well, you know, yeah, we have been doing that, we probably shouldn't have? I mean, it's not really clear because you don't ever get a extended discussion of that, and so it's not clear who had been doing it, when they had been doing it, anything like that. But at least by implication, they're kind of saying that, you know, this behavior has been going on recently enough for Ghan-buri-Ghan to say, you know, stop doing it, which implies that they've been doing it fairly recently, you would think. So that's interesting in and of itself. And, you know, there's other things too, but the main thing here is just, it's another really interesting world building event too, because Tolkien, in the middle of having, you know, like a bunch of really Western European standard type people in Gondor and Rohan, throws in this completely different group of humans that look completely different, have a completely different language, and have just been like forgotten by the outside cultures for the most part. And that's, it's like it makes you really want to know more about them. And so eventually I will do that video on what the Unfinished Tales tells us about them and get into that. But for now, that is what I wanted to cover in this video. So hope you enjoy that and gained some interesting insight into Tolkien's world beyond the more standard stuff that we tend to think of. It's a really small episode, but it's really interesting, and it tells us a lot without telling us much at all. So if you did enjoy that, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore for some occasional Tolkien-related trivia questions. You can subscribe to the channel here. You can support the channel here. And you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.